Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this discussion titled "The Day After Soleimani: Are the U.S. and Iran Headed to War?" The title promises a lot, but we have an excellent panel here, great experts, and I'm really appreciative that they accepted to show up at such short notice. As you know, this event happened only last Friday, and we've been discussing DC debate has shifted from impeachment to Iran, and so as you all know, Qassem Soleimani, the head of Iran's elite Quds military force, and he was perceived as one of the most powerful figures in the region, being sort of managing Iran's involvement in Iraq, Syria, in Lebanon, elsewhere beyond that as well, in terms of relations with the Gulf states as well. So he was killed in an operation by the U.S., and then already there were a lot of tensions because U.S. Trump administration pulled out of the nuclear deal, and in the region there have been several months that there's a bit of a tit for tat over, the oil facilities attacked by Iran, and lastly, I guess last week, only 10 days now, I'm like, with all the news, it's hard to get the timeline of things, but there was an attack on a U.S. contractor. Trump administration responded, killing, I believe, 49 people. And then, anyway, finally, this decision was made on Soleimani, and now there's a lot of talk about whether the two countries are headed to war, although we all know Trump himself has said it many times, he doesn't want another war in the Middle East. So it seems like a contradiction, but we are hoping to get a sense of this, what's going on and where we might be headed with this great panel of experts. We have with us Director of Foreign Policy with the Heritage Foundation, Luke Coffey. Just to his left, Rita Farsi is now Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Just to his left, Mark Perry, independent author and journalist. He's written more than 10 books on U.S. military. Just to his left, Kılıç Kanat is our research director, my colleague here at the SETA Foundation. I want to thank them all, and we'll start with Mark Perry. We figured he knows the discussions, the military discussions, and who may have helped Trump push the button. He has a piece out at the American Conservative website this morning, and he talks about absence of Mattis, General Mattis, but he told us that Pompeo was driving this process, but we are hoping to get more sort of granularity about how that process worked and why this decision was made, and Trump hit the button, basically. Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. In my article this morning in the American Conservative, I point out a number of factors I think that weighed into the decision to kill Qassem Soleimani and how the decision was made. But I have to tell you, the minute that the Soleimani assassination became news, I thought, as a journalist, well, this story will be easy to get. You just call this general and this retired general and this foreign policy analyst, and then you find out how the decision was made. You might even get the PowerPoint, and easy peasy, no problem. 1,500 words, I can get it done. And what struck me in the immediate aftermath of the assassination was that was not true. The lid on this was really tight, tighter than any other thing that I'd seen in this administration and any previous iteration of a foreign policy decision. They latcheted this thing down. And the second thing that I noticed about the decision was that there was an inner circle and not many beyond it. This assassination, this incident, this targeting of Soleimani and the actual pulling of the trigger took people in the Pentagon, even at the secondary level where there's usually a lot of information, took them by surprise. And the immediate, within 20 minutes of the announcement coming over the radio and television, I was receiving phone calls from people saying, "Is this true?" And these are from people who usually call me and say, "It's true." Now they're asking me whether it was true. It took a lot to unlock this, and I found that really surprising. And for these reasons, I came to the initial conclusion that the decision was made very quickly, almost on the spur of the moment, that it was this was not a month-long, well-planned through operation. That said, Soleimani's been on anyone's target list, and for many years, this was under consideration during the Obama administration. But I think that this was really a spur of the moment. We found from Los Angeles Times, Washington Post reporting, and my own reporting, that this was one of many options, 6, so far as I can tell, options that the president had a choice of in responding to proxy attacks on American forces and the death of a U.S. contractor in Iraq, and not an option that the military believed that he would pick. But if you present the option to the president, he's going to choose, this president in particular is known for choosing the one that no one seems he will, and he does. It took everyone by surprise. "Are you sure, Mr. President, that you don't want number 4? No, number Soleimani sounds good." That said, there wasn't anyone in that room of Pompeo and Esper and Milley who leaned the head of the Joint Staff who leaned across the table and said, "Mr. President, maybe we ought to rethink this." It was a, "Yes, sir, we'll get it done, we'll find them." And that's how it was done. This process was driven by primarily Mike Pompeo, which gives some discomfort to my Pentagon friends who believe that the military and the Secretary of Defense, after all, they're in the chain of command and the Secretary of State is not. There is some discomfort that the people who are in the chain of command are somewhat marginalized, and that there's great deference paid to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who, by the way, when he speaks, even in public, speaks in military terms. This is Secretary of State who's #1 in his class of 1986 at West Point, the same class as Mark Esper. This is a really, and I don't think it's an exaggeration, this is a militarized foreign policy administration. The default position of this administration is to push buttons and to do violence. That's my first kind of overall take on this. My second observation is that in the immediate wake of this killing, the mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, in particular, kind of recoiled from the idea that this meant war. Well, you heard this with Rachel Maddow. You also heard it with Anderson Cooper. Even Tucker Carlson said, "Well, but certainly the Iranians know. Certainly the Iranians know that we're the most powerful military in the world. They're going to be very careful in their response. It's going to be very calibrated. Maybe they won't respond at all. After all, we can exact punishment, and we will exact punishment. They must know this." So there was kind of a recoiling on the part of the mainstream media, which made me smile because in my estimation, since I've been asked to answer the question, are the U.S. and Iran headed to war? In my estimation, the response from Iran will not be controlled. It will not be proportional. It will be violent, non-proportional, intimate, ugly, and very, very soon. Now, history it seems to me, bears this out. We all remember when the National Security Council in Tehran sat around trying to determine a proportional response to America's deployment of U.S. Marines to Beirut. And they say, they back and forth and back and forth. And somebody said, here's an idea. Let's put an explosive in a pickup truck and blow up the Marine barracks. And they all went, yeah, that's a good idea. It wasn't proportional. It didn't take long. It wasn't the object of what the mainstream media calls the Persian mind. This was an act of war. The assassination of Qassem Soleimani was an act of war, and we should expect, I would suspect, an immediate response. My third kind of observation on this is that we should not expect the Iranians to target a lead commander, back on the proportional point, that because we killed Qassem Soleimani, they're going to target the U.S. Central Command commander, Kenneth McKenzie. There are some things that I think are just too tough militarily for Iran to do, and that kind of proportional response is not in the cards. Finally, I think that history kind of shines a light on where we are, and it frames what I hope our understanding is of what's happening. And I would like to recommend, and I don't do this lightly. Of course, I recommend my own article this morning in the American Conservative. I hope you all read it. But if you're not going to read that, Graham Fuller earlier this week wrote a piece on his blog, U.S. Foreign Policy by Assassination. Graham is a 25, 30-year veteran of the U.S. intelligence services, has served for many, many years in the Middle East and knows it well. And this, I think, is probably the best commentary I've read on what the assassination of Qassem Soleimani means. And he pleads, and as my final point, I would plead that we kind of be adults on this, and that we not be captured by some kind of wishful thinking, and I'll put on my historian's hat. In August of 1941, I don't think it's a stretch to make this analogy. In August of 1941, the Japanese high command calculated that the United States was going to continue their campaign of maximum pressure on them, embargoes, and that the Japanese needed to teach us a lesson and back us off. And that the best way to do this, the best way to ensure peace, would be a defensive maneuver that would teach us that we shouldn't want to go to war with them. And that the best way to teach us this lesson was to bomb Pearl Harbor. And that if they did that, we would calculate that the price that we would pay for going to war with Japan was too steep. And we would come to the peace table and negotiate with them a new Pacific understanding. 4 years later, we had obliterated every single one of their major cities. It was an unbelievably stupid miscalculation on their part that we would somehow back off and respond proportionally to their attack. We didn't. The Iranians aren't going to either. What's going to happen over the next days and weeks, and since I'm going to ask the question, I'm supposed to answer the question, are the U.S. and Iran headed to war? We've been at war with Iran for 40 years. It's just gotten much more ugly. And my prediction, my crystal ball tells me that in the weeks ahead, it's going to get uglier still, it's going to escalate, and that the prospects for war between the US and Iran are increasing and increasingly likely.
Thank
I'll
you,
leave it at
Mark,
that.
for that bleak picture you just have shown us. But I obviously have questions to you as well. But let's turn to Tarita for his assessment of what's happening now.
Good. Thank you so much, Kadir. Thank you to Seta for always being so quick, putting together a panel immediately after something has happened. And thank you all here for being here. That was a very bleak picture that Mark presented. I find myself largely in agreement, a couple of disagreements on what I think the Iranians will do, and I'll get to that later or perhaps in the broader conversation. I want to take a step back and look at an other angle of this. We have heard repeatedly, without any evidence being presented, that Soleimani was there to prepare some form of an imminent attack against the United States. Members of Congress who have been briefed had said that this was very thin, or they didn't fully understand what the imminence of this was. But something else that puts this under question is that the Iraqi prime minister in the parliament stated that actually Soleimani was there to meet with the Iraqi prime minister as part of a mediation effort that the Iraqis had undertaken between Saudi Arabia and Iran. If you had paid attention in the last couple of weeks, there were also articles in the Wall Street Journal, in New York Times, that had stated that the Saudis had started to do some outreach to the Iranians. Soleimani was there, according to the Iraqi prime minister, to give the Iranian response to the Saudi letter on how to reduce tensions in the region, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that's when Trump assassinated him. Now, there's a deeper meaning of this, which is, why is it that the Saudis began, after so long, to respond to some of the Iranian requests for diplomacy just a couple of months ago with the help of the Iraqis? The key thing that changed was that after Trump earlier on actually showed restraint, when the Iranians shot down an American drone, which they said was in Iranian territory, Trump was close to responding, but then 10 minutes before, he called it off. Later on, when there was an attack against Saudi oil fields that the US says Iran was behind, which is a very likely conclusion, he also indicated that he's not going to go to war and put American servicemen and women at risk on behalf of the House of Saud. As the Saudis and the UAE realized that they're not going to be able to rent the American military to fight their own battles with Iran, they started exercising an option that always had been at their disposal, which was to start negotiations and start reducing tensions. They did so in Yemen, with exchanges of prisoners with the Houthis. They did so vis-a-vis Qatar to a certain extent. The UAE even sent their own officials to Iran, and you had an exchange there. When it came to the Saudis, they came in a little bit later, and it was more quiet, and it was through the Iraqis. What it tells us is that rather than this common belief in Washington that the Middle East will fall apart if the United States is not there, the thing that stands between chaos in the Middle East is the United States, the thing that holds it together. Seems to me that there may be some indications that the opposite may also be true, or perhaps is true, which is that when the United States said that it's not going to fight these war for these countries, instead of then pushing the US to go to war on their behalf, they started exercising diplomacy. Now, there's no guarantee that that diplomacy actually would have been successful. A more reasonable Saudi Arabia would not necessarily have begotten a more reasonable Tehran. But it is interesting that the diplomacy in earnest did not begin until the US made clear to them that it would not go to war with Iran on their behalf. That process was in the making. That's why Soleimani was in Iraq, according to the Iraqis. Whether that has not completely ended, and whether now some of these US allies have another license to be reckless, as they have been in the past decade, remains to be seen. But I think beyond whether there's going to be war with the US or not, it should also warrant us to ask ourselves some very profound questions about what actually is the US's role and the meaning of the US's role in the Middle East, not just for the United States, but for the region as a whole. Now, I certainly hope that Mark is wrong. I fear that he might be right. I don't think, however, the response from the Iranians necessarily are going to play out the way Mark said it would. First of all, I think the Iranian government probably is right now taking advantage of an unprecedented sentiment of unity that exists in Iran right now as a result of this assassination. There's been plenty of folks in this town who have questioned the idea that if attacked, the Iranians would rally around the flag. Just go on YouTube, just watch some TV and see the massive crowds that are out there. And don't for a second believe that those crowds necessarily are now pro-regime or like the government. I personally strongly believe that that is not the case. What you're seeing is a sentiment of outpouring of nationalism, sense of unity, has nothing to do with the government. So the idea that this would be some sort of a blow to the regime and weaken it, we've clearly seen the opposite, at least in the short term. I think the government is going to try to capitalize on that in the beginning. I think they will take a bit of time because I think they will try to utilize the element of surprise. If they do something too soon, they won't have it. If they wait a little bit longer, perhaps there will be. They have themselves said, and that may be them trying to confuse the world, that the response would be proportionate and it would be targeting a military target since Soleimani was a military target. We don't know if that's the case. We don't know if that's something they're saying to have a plausible deniability if something else then happens. But I do find it unlikely that they wouldn't respond. And under normal circumstances, their response may have been calibrated to be such that they can signal the United States that Iran had no option but to respond, but it did something that would be proportionate but not escalatory. Under normal circumstances, not only perhaps would they have done that, but it would also have been read that way over here. We are not in normal circumstances. And as a result, even if the Iranians try to do something that essentially exacts their revenge, is proportionate, but does not escalate, and leaves the door open for the Trump administration not to do so, I'm not so convinced that that will be read that way by the president, or that his incentive structure at this point is not to further escalate. I was one of those who did believe earlier on that Trump actually didn't want to have a war, had nothing to do with an assessment about his love for humanity, had an assessment about whether he thought that would be good for him electorally or not. Today, I'm not so sure. And I think that what may have changed is his calculation of how this will play out electorally, particularly in the context of impeachment taking place. I'm not so sure that calculation is right from him, but I am struck by the very dramatic shift that has taken place between July and the posture that Trump took then, and then what happened just 10 days or so ago. Something big happened, which I don't think can be explained by just looking at developments on the ground in Iraq. Something else, something potentially politically, I think, may have played a very significant role in his decision and may play a very significant role in his decision as to how to respond to a potential Iranian response, whether that one is proportionate or not. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Trita. Luke, there is a bit of a disagreement about the timing and how it might play out, but both speakers are saying Iran will definitely respond. And how did that, do you think, how will that play into what's coming up? Do you feel like administration calculated that, and what kind of response do they expect?
Right. Well, I want to echo everyone's thanks to Seta and to you, Kader, for inviting me to speak. I've actually, I speak more publicly at this think tank than I do my own think tank at the Heritage Foundation. So it's always it's like my second home when I'm downtown.
Thank you.
So it's great to be here. I do believe that there will be some sort of Iranian response. I think this is probably quite obvious. I think that's a matter of open debate on what this response will be. They are very limited in their options if they want to do it proportionately. And from a military point of view, they're, I would say, even more limited. I saw a news article over the weekend saying that they've deployed their F-14s to the border. Well, yeah, enough said about that. I guess we need to think how they will be thinking more creatively, I think, than just it'll be more asymmetrical. It will not be symmetrical. So I think there's probably some agreement with that among the panel. Now, in terms of, does this mean war? Are we headed to war? Well, I agree with Mark that we've been at some sort of war with the Islamic Republic since 1979. And on today's topic, Qassem Soleimani, this is a man whose hands are dripping with American blood. And the official figures are more than 600 US soldiers, Marines have been killed by EFPs or other armaments provided by Iran to its proxy forces. Let's just say that this number is wildly off. Let's just say it's a third of that number. It's still 200 US soldiers. If you look at the wake of destruction across huge sections of the Middle East that can be attributed to Iran's malign influence, whether in parts of Lebanon and Syria, to a certain extent in Yemen, and across Iraq, the tentacles of this apparatus reaches capitals in Europe. Even here in the United States with the planned assassination of the Saudi ambassador. So my only complaint about the timing of Qassem Soleimani's demise is the fact that it didn't happen sooner. And I do not believe for a second that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, being professional military men with more than 40 years of service, very professional, would ever give the President of the United States an option that they did not think they could fulfill, that they did not understand the consequences of, or that they did not think we should do. And I suspect, and I have no proof of this, I could be entirely wrong, but just inferring from what I'm reading and hearing, I suspect that President Trump has been given this option before. You look at Ambassador Bolton's tweet over the weekend where he congratulated this successful mission. He said it had been a long time coming. And I suspect that President Trump had been given this option in the past and he's rejected it because he's wanted to keep the door open for a negotiated settlement with Iran. I don't believe this administration is is very militarized or the kill administration or push the button administration. Trump does not he can barely tolerate US troops in Germany, right? So he doesn't want US troops in Afghanistan. He doesn't want them in Syria. He's telling the South Koreans that they have to pay an insane amount of money to keep US troops in South Korea. He, on the campaign trail, talks about ending these forever wars, as he calls them. So the idea that he's out looking for a war with Iran, in many ways, I think he's shown restraint, as was already pointed out over the summer. And I think that if the Emirates and the Saudi Arabians had formed a certain calculation that because of Trump's restraint, that they can no longer rely on President Trump to send US soldiers into harm's way to protect Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, well, the strike on Qassem Soleimani has probably changed or altered that calculation to some extent. And then the final point I'll make before we sort of open, or I guess Killage needs to speak.
Yes.
So poor Killage down there at the end. Before we open it up, though, is that in the same way that we have not seen the evidence and there's zero public proof that this intelligence wasn't quite stacked up to what it's been said to be, there's zero evidence or proof in what the Iraqi prime minister has said. And I'm sorry, but I am not believing for 1 second that if the Saudi Arabians did want to open up diplomatic channels to Iran, that they would choose Qassem Soleimani in Iraq to do it. And this is what Oman is for, right? And especially considering that just a few months ago, a military strike from Iran, or at least sponsored or orchestrated by Iranian proxies, took offline a huge chunk of their oil production. And then all of a sudden, Saudi Arabia wants to try to use Qassem Soleimani in Iraq to broker some sort of back-channel peace agreement. And after dipping in and out of Iraq dozens of times over the past 4 or 5 years, that this one time that Qassem Soleimani flies into Baghdad, he's there on a peace mission, I am not buying that for a second. And in fact, I'm more inclined to believe people like Secretary Esper or British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, who just in the House of Commons today, before we came onto the stage, said that he's seen the intelligence and he says that the U.S. has a credible case about this idea of an imminent attack. But even without this idea of an imminent attack, we've already seen what Qassem Soleimani has done. And there are millions of people, millions of Muslims in the Middle East who are breathing a sigh of relief, and there is no one here that knows if what awaits us in the future will be any worse than what we've already experienced with Qassem Soleimani. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Kulish, Luke alluded to the feelings in the region.
I see the tension.
We got to make this interesting, right?
Well, how does it? Turkey made some statements about this, emphasized resolving tensions, emphasizing diplomacy. How does it look for a country like Turkey, a regional power, and how does it look from, let's say, outside? Because U.S.-Iran direct unannounced war, as the panel is saying, has been ongoing for a long time.
Thank you, Kadir, and thank you for SETA organizing this. It is like home to me. So there are a couple of things. Looking from the outside, I guess there are a couple of questions and concerns about what happened. And the first is, of course, the rationale behind the attack, especially the timing behind the attack. So part of that is about whether if there is an imminent attack and what was the imminent attack. Because what happened was, I think we don't know the intelligence about that. We don't see any intelligence or anything about what really happened actually. But the statements that were coming through from the administration the day after the event, the attack was somehow confusing. So it started with there is an imminent attack, then the talking point changed that he killed a lot of American soldiers. So in the meantime, there was a lot of confusion. Was it because of the past attacks he did, or was it because of a future potential imminent attack? Why the really attack took place at this point? The second one was, of course, everybody was in the world actually started to talk about whether if this is a diversionary move, whether because of the election impeachment process or not. But more astute analysis look at the potential ramification of an embassy attack to the presidents. So what happened in 1979 in Carter administration, or what happened in 2012 after the Benghazi attack, and the potential repercussions of these kind of embassy attacks to the president's credibility and strength actually. So many people from the outside thought that there's 11 months to elections, and probably nobody will remember this in 2020 election, presidential election. But there was this consideration that both Carter and Obama was criticized for being weak. Maybe President Trump wanted to respond in a way that he is not Obama, which he likes to do. The second question was about the strategy, and unfortunately, nobody is clear about what is U.S. strategy about this, whether this is a one-time attack, whether United States pay attention or take into consideration of second or third order consequences of such an attack, what can happen. We are not clear. So Secretary Pompeo stated that there is a strategy to make Iran to act like a normal nation. He stated this in one of the TV interviews, which he was in 5 of them on Sunday morning. And it is not clear if the strategy is that, is it because United States wants to renegotiate JCPOA? Is it still on the table? And if there is diplomacy is still on the table, at least on the US part, so stopping JCPOA, sanctioning Iran, and killing Soleimani, how this will contribute to a negotiation, a path towards the negotiation. And secondly, is it part of a larger strategy? And if it's a larger strategy, the killing of Soleimani may be a tactical or operational blow to Iran in the region. But since the attack, United States started sending more troops to Middle East. And as far as we remember, the new strategy of the United States was ending the long and endless wars and moving towards Asia or China Pacific, Asia Pacific. So would it cause a strategic impediment towards US while just hurting Iran operationally or tactically? And the third point, it releases an important, actually, a wake-up call about a significant threat. Since the attack happened, actually, the night of the attack, everybody started to discuss. They don't discuss why Soleimani was killed. Probably everybody know that it is probably one of the usual suspects about in US, actually, the hit list. But the concern was what would be the consequences of it. And since that time, we see different scenarios. And those scenarios are actually kind of very dangerous scenarios about the potential proxies of Iran in the region, potential terrorist attacks of Iran in different countries. And that means there is a country that can really destabilize the region, that has those proxy forces. And so far, Obama administration at least ignored that part of the issue and focused on JCPOA too much and ignored the proxy forces and how Iran actually, if he wills, can destabilize the region and can do more harmful things to the to countries in the region. So this was another thing that many people like, this, nobody should feel this vulnerable and no country in the world should make the region this vulnerable. So this is another issue that people started to discuss. The fact that United States didn't let any allies know about this attack was somehow concerning because as far as we know, nobody knew about the attack, and even Secretary Pompeo complained that it didn't get enough support from the French and German foreign ministers about this attack. So unilateralism is nice. It may give pleasure, but it has costs as well. So at this point, there was a lot of concern about the U.S. allies in the region, whether it is, whether this is, a new mode of action for the United States when it is planning to do something about the region. Finally, I think there are a lot of debates. Probably there will be a lot of debates over here, but the issue of handling this crisis in its aftermath, I think that created more question marks than answers. The fact that President Trump's tweet about the cultural sites, Vice President Pence's statement about 9/11 and Iran, and New York Times report about the decision-making mechanism at the White House when this decision was made, that the generals were stunned about the decision, whether it is correct or not. These are basically right now circulating in the media, probably in all of the countries in the region, and they are trying to figure out what happened, and each and every statement is making things much more complicated and providing more question marks than answers. And this would create a major problem for the US credibility in the region for the future foreign policy actions.
Thank you, Kılıç. I'll take it that you mentioned, highlighted a couple of issues, including whether JCPOA is on the table, if basically diplomatic route is still open, unilateralism. These are shared by regional powers, including Turkey. So I won't press you too much on Turkey's position, not now, but maybe we'll come back to it. Mark, so a couple of things were raised in terms of the timing of the Iranian response, as well as whether this was a smart decision. Is there a strategy here where it's headed? And you did talk about Pompeo's role. When these things happen, big things, if they're pinned on an individual, right? Pompeo seems to own it also over the weekend. What do you think it's going to be politically for him individually going forward, and then how it could play out in future decisions of Trump regarding Iran?
Mike Pompeo is the Deputy President of the United States. He is. He's the most powerful figure in the administration. He's the most influential. He has the president's ear. He has inserted himself into the chain of command in the military. He is without peer in this administration. Let me just respond a little bit also
Sure.
to my friend, colleague, Luke Coffey, about Iran's tentacles and malign influence in the region. Let's suppose that the administration actually has a strategy for the Middle East. They don't, but let's suppose they do. And that the strategy is to end Iran's malign influence in the region. Does the killing of Qassem Soleimani accomplish that? Does it support the dissidents in Tehran who want a shift in their government? Does it give counsel and comfort to our allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel, whose prime minister said yesterday, this is between Iran and the United States, we don't have anything to do with this. Wonderful ally Israel is, the United States. Does this activity support and reinforce our position in Iraq? What does this do that's so good? This man is responsible for 653, by one general officer's count, talk to me, 653 Americans, and must be held accountable for it. And my answer is, grow up. What did we think was going to happen when we invaded Iraq? Did we really think they were going to spread rose petals on the treads of our tanks? This is what happens in war. This is a terrible thing. It's very ugly and it's very bloody, but we need to ask a lot of questions. Was it legal? Let's suppose it was legal. Was there really an imminent threat? Let's suppose there was. The real question is, was this a smart thing to do? Does this help our political position in the Middle East or not? I understand Mr. Trump is a real non-interventionist and he wants to withdraw our troops from the Middle East. Baloney. There's going to be more troops in the Middle East, and there's going to be an escalation because this is an escalation.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I feel
Teresa.
like just
Yeah.
two-finger intervention, as
Sure,
they say. Yeah.
sure.
Well, Mark, you're right. This is what happens in war, and that's why Soleimani's dead. And that's very straightforward. He was a combatant. He often wore a uniform. He's a general officer in a military that was involved in killing U.S. service personnel. So frankly, he had it coming. That's very in that sense. I don't see why Qassem Soleimani has this protected species status in the Middle East. He's the only person he's the only military officer who is like exempt from getting zapped.
I'm not questioning the morality of it. I'm questioning
saying,
the political wisdom of it.
Well, and you pose all these questions. Does it make Iran weaker? Does it help the dissidents in Iran? Does it advance U.S. interests? Yes, the death of Qassem Soleimani, no longer on the face of this earth, to do what he does best, will only bring benefits to the United States in the long run, and more importantly, not just to the United States, but more importantly to the region, to the hundreds of thousands of people who are no longer in their homes in Syria, or to the thousands of people who have been caught up in the killings in Iraq. And look, I'm not saying that.
No, what you're talking about is a justification for vengeance. You are not talking about something that actually improves the situation going forward.
Oh no, it will
Those
improve
are
it.
two completely
No, it will
different
improve
things.
it.
Well, no, actually,
Middle
you
East
prove
will
it.
be
You
better.
mentioned that things will get better.
Yeah.
What has gotten better? The
Because
Iraqi
one of the
parliament
most
just asked the United States to leave Iraq. A couple of months ago, you had massive protests by Iraqis against the influence of Iran. Today, they're protesting the influence of the United States. A lot of Iraqis who absolutely had no love whatsoever for Soleimani, no love for Iran, felt insulted, felt that their dignity has been violated by the United States committing an assassination outside of their airport without any consultation with the prime minister. The prime minister said that he actually spoke to Trump 6 hours before it happened, but no mention of this. To turn this to say that this will make things better, then make that argument. But going out there saying that this is justified for revenge is a different story.
One of the most destructive forces in the Middle East is now gone. He cannot be easily replaced. He had a unique talent for unconventional warfare. He was a unique and special individual. He will not be easily replaced. And the havoc that he has wreaked across much of the Middle East is going to, at least temporarily...
Your argument as to why this is smart is going back to say this was a bad guy. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Taking out Saddam Hussein, going into Iraq, invading that country, has not improved the lives of people. No, hold on, I'm not finished.
You can compare the two situations.
In any way, shape, or form. It was the most destabilizing event of the Middle East in the last 30, 40 years. It didn't matter if Saddam Hussein was a good guy or a bad guy. He was a horrible guy. But it was still an utterly destabilizing and stupid thing for the United States to do that really undermined the U.S.'s own national interest and undermined the stability of the Middle East. Now you're using the exact same argument. You cannot articulate an argument as to how things actually will improve. Instead, you're constantly going back and saying, this was a bad guy. It was a bad guy. So what? The question is, how is this actually making it better?
One of the most destructive forces in the Middle East is gone. You cannot say that Saddam was one of the most destructive forces in the Middle East.
Well, actually, that's exactly what you guys said.
Who are you guys?
That's exactly.
No, you said. I think we're both Americans.
No. You said that you were a neocon before. You said you were a neocon before. That somehow that's grown out of you. I've not seen evidence of that, but nevertheless. But you mentioned that you were a neocon earlier on when we spoke, and that's exactly what the neocons said. They said that Saddam is the most dangerous thing in the region. If we don't do this, we cannot allow a mushroom cloud to be the smoking gun. So don't tell me that's not an argument that he was the most dangerous person.
At the time of the invasion of Iraq, I was a 23-year-old first lieutenant in the U.S. Army. I would have invaded Canada. Okay? People grow, people learn. And I'm telling you now that I can admit
you didn't invade Canada.
Hey, I can admit, in 2003 I supported invading Iraq. Guess what? I was wrong. I was 23 years old.
The question is, what have you learned?
I was the one calling the shots at the time.
It's great that you realize you were wrong. What have you learned? Because you're making the same mistake here. Thinking that's because someone is a bad guy. No, but essentially you're saying that because he was bad, that justifies that everything will become positive afterwards. Has nothing to do with that. The United States is undermining its own strategic interest.
No.
It should not be this involved in the region.
We'll find out.
It's a strategic interest of the United States.
Look, right
if this was making it so safe, why is everyone pulling their personnel out of the Middle East? The State Department going out telling all Americans, leave Iraq immediately.
But Tirita,
how is this making America any better?
Here's my question. So you disagree on the source of instability in the region?
The source of
we get that. So those kind of, I was going to ask you actually this exact question. Iraq, right? Iraqi parliament took a decision, and Prime Minister is yet to ask the U.S. to leave.
Which we should also point out that half of the parliamentarians weren't even present to vote.
He just made a statement saying that he actually received the letter from the CENTCOM about withdrawal of U.S. troops.
Will he be in a position to actually ask the U.S. to leave? Because if the U.S. leaves, right, he's left with Iran. And do you think that's a likelihood? Or is he going to use this in his talks with the U.S. for whatever, he can get?
He may have the calculations of trying to utilize it as leverage against the United States. But the political realities of Iraq have now turned such that any support for the United States being there has been dramatically undermined. Now, I personally believe that if the United States were to withdraw militarily, no one is talking about the United States withdrawing its diplomatic or other types of presence, that he actually, in the medium to long term, would really allow the Iraqi nationalists who want the equal type of exit of Iranians out of Iraq to have a much clearer way of doing so. We just saw that right now, how they were protesting against Iranian influence in Iraq just a month ago. And now the entire landscape changed as a result of the assassination. So if the United States is out militarily, the Iranians are going to run out of their excuses, and you're going to see a much more unified effort by Iraqis to reestablish their own sovereignty, which they deserve.
So there's a silver lining? Am I hearing you right?
Sorry, your name again? Luke mentioned several times that, Trump wants to lead the Middle East, and you're absolutely right. He has said that several times, but when an opportunity emerged in which the Iraqis actually asked the United States to leave, what did he do? He threw a fit. He threatened to sanction them. So where actually has he withdrawn? Except for talking a big game about it, he has sent more troops to the Middle East just in the last couple of months. We've not really seen that in action. He is implementing that sentiment. I think he's saying it more than anything else because he knows that a very significant element of his constituency and the American public large want to leave the Middle East militarily. He knows it's a good talking point. He knows that it makes him sound better than the neocons that got us into Iraq. But in practice, we're not seeing him actually doing any of that.
I'll turn to Luke on this because we discussed it many times here, how actually Trump wanted to pull out of Syria, but it's been basically rebuffed by Pentagon, CENTCOM. I think, Trita, in Syrian case, Trump really tried several times. He announced it several times. It just hasn't been kind of
He's the president, right?
Yes, but
if he wants to do it, do it.
But there's a imperfect comparison in my mind here that he announced mission accomplished against ISIS. Okay, we are out. So he can do the similar thing in Iraq and say, you know what, we're not going to keep fighting Iran in Iraq. We're just pulling out, and then Pentagon will rebuff again, and we'll have more troops. But I want to turn to Luke, if you let me know. Sorry, if you allow me. So, can you comment on that? Trump says he wants to pull out of the Middle East, but the actions keep dragging him back. Both Mark and Trita and Kılıç actually pointed out that.
Yeah, well, that is a problem that he has, and President Trump has shown in the past that he will go against the advice of his advisors. I mean, if you remember at the time of the Jerusalem decision, most of the cabinet at that time, the cabinet looks a lot different now, but the cabinet at that time was against doing this decision, and President Trump ignored that advice, and he went ahead and did it anyway. Most of the additional troops that have been sent to the Middle East in the past few months have been force protection to protect the troops that are there. Which
they're more safe.
Well, no, of course not. Of course, they're not more safe. I mean, we just had a 45-minute discussion on how Iran's going to retaliate. When I say that the region is going to be more stable and safer, I'm talking about going forward with Qassem Soleimani off the face of this earth. I just find it very difficult that anyone could think that his demise is going to bring more instability to the region.
In the military, they call this the Yamamoto effect. In the middle of World War II, we killed the most important Japanese commander in the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto. But there was a real debate in the administration, in the Roosevelt administration, the military, whether we should do it.
Sorry, I'm having difficulty following these World War II analogies with killing Qassem Soleimani.
Well, let me finish the analogy. So the question was, do we kill him because we don't know whether the guy who's going to replace him is worse. The guy who replaced him was worse. And it's called the Yamamoto effect in the military, where there was a real debate about whether to do something. That is, militarily, whether it's to your benefit. No such debate occurred in the military senior leadership on Qassem Soleimani. We have yet to, wait a second.
We don't know that.
Wait, we do know it.
You think that General Milley just woke up one morning and thought, I'll drone strike Qassem Soleimani?
People can disagree with the process that this government follows. People can disagree with the conclusions that our senior leaders come to. But there's no process here. This is whimsical.
That's so disrespectful to what is a very professional U.S. Armed Forces. And it goes back to my point that if you think that General Milley just woke up one day and thought, I'm going to present an option that I know the president won't pick, and that is to kill Qassem Soleimani, as you already alluded to, this president has shown over the past 2 or 3 years to do that one option. So surely our officials must know this by now, that there is no safe option to give to the president.
I never thought I'd be on a panel praising James Mattis, but here goes. James Mattis was asked by H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, to provide options on Iran and attacking Iran. Mattis said no. He didn't want to present the President of the United States, this president, with options that he might actually pick from. He tried to dampen the move towards war. He tried to undercut the tendency towards escalation in this administration.
And look at
That's
everything Iran has done since Mattis has left.
Like what?
Okay, well, for starters, attacking the oil tankers, attacking the Aramco site, shooting down a U.S. drone in international airspace, and everyone says, oh, this was just a drone. This drone costs $180 million a piece. It's not just a drone. With zero acknowledgement that they did it.
When Mr. Trump wanted to respond to the drone attack
He didn't.
But he didn't, because Jack Keane, not a pacifist, a four-star general retired, said, Mr. President, don't do it, it's out of proportion, let's not do this. A military guy.
Kılıç, I want to turn to the audience, but I want to bring it back to maybe Turkey and say Turkey emphasized
Yeah, exactly, for once.
we're trying to drag Turkey now. Like, I mean,
Turkey definitely doesn't want that.
they emphasize diplomacy. Do you see any room? Of course, this happened only Friday, and we can see in the panel that, you know, these disagreements are very sharp. We don't know how it's going to play, etc. So do you see that an opening for diplomacy anytime soon?
At this point, I just want to say a few words before skipping to Turkey question, and I know that you are dragging me to that. One is, so regarding the Iranian influence, so Mark, if you ask the Syrians, yeah, there is a bad influence of Iran in their country. So the question is not whether Iran has bad influence or malign influence, whatever you want to call it, but the question is whether the killing of Soleimani will end that influence or not, or whether it would expedite that or deteriorate that influence or not.
It'll have no impact at
Yeah,
all.
probably not, because of that. This is the question. This is I think the debate right now.
It'll be disruptive.
It can be disruptive. It can be operational disruptive. Everybody who is talking about or writing the profile of Soleimani is saying that he's a tactical genius and other things about him. But the question is whether it can really influence the Iranian influence. And I think the scenarios that we have been talking about, Iran may attack the US allies in the region, Iran may mobilize its proxies or doing other things. I think it should be an eye-opener that while we are talking about JCPOA and other things, we should also talk about Iranian proxy activity in the region, which in the long term can be much more destabilizing. And regarding Turkey, I don't, at this point, the diplomacy, as I said, there was, you know, like the getting out of JCPOA sanctions, and on top of that, the killing of Soleimani. I think there is, you have to be really, really creative at this point to find a diplomatic solution for this. Mm-hmm. Everybody is asking for de-escalation right now. So the D word is de-escalation right now, not even diplomacy. So I think probably we need time for this. And President Erdogan in a press conference stated that there should be, both sides needs to be calm and find a solution for this and de-escalate the conflict. So everybody is hoping for, at this point, de-escalation. And diplomacy is probably would be the second or third order option for this. Right now, everybody is concerned that there will be a retaliation in Iran, disproportionate maybe, which would create another attack from the United States, which would make the region much more, unstable. And considering the countries in the region, they are, especially Iraq, Saudi Arabia, they are probably concerned that it may take place in their soil, not anywhere else, not Iran or not any other parts of the world.
Yeah, like you said, Erdogan also mentioned that, there will be likely a response by Iran, but they need to find a diplomatic route. Anyway, I want to turn to the audience. I want to collect several questions, and I'll make sure that they're all answered. Do we have the microphone? Please make wait for the microphone. Here, there, and there.
There we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Paolo von Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute.
You can take
Oh,
a seat because of the camera.
Oh, sorry.
Global Policy Institute.
My own take, a very, very extremely short comment, but there's a question, is that this thing has been blown completely out of proportion. In other words, I don't think this is as important as we would like it to be. This has been justified officially as establishing some red lines. You kill Americans, there is a price. And guess what? We can target the head of the bad guys. And so we did. I don't really think this is a game changer by any means. Of course, it's
What's the question?
The question is this: sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
The real American policy about Iran is sanctions. My understanding, and I would like to know the thinking of the panelists, is that the sanctions are working. Forget about killing Soleimani. Iran is on the ropes. Iran has no more money. My understanding from what I hear from people in Lebanon and elsewhere, Hezbollah is running out of money, running out of cash. That's a surprising development that has gone worse in recent months. Which is to say, and this is what Secretary Pompeo said even today, we want Iran to stop its misbehaving. If they do, we're ready to talk. So is that something if Iran is indeed on the ropes because of lack of money, because the sanctions are biting, that this is really progressively the game changer? Thank you.
Over there on the second row.
My name's Alec Medine. I'm a master's candidate of history at Georgetown University. This question is in response to Mr. Perry's gloomy assessment that indeed we might see an escalation of the war, but I'm going to leave this question open to everybody to answer. My question is, if it comes down to it, what will this war look like? Are American troops going to invade Iran and march on Tehran, or will we see a more concentrated effort to attack Iranian assets and irregular forces all throughout the Middle East where U.S. troops are already present? Thank you.
Thank you. Fourth row over there, yes.
Hi, my name is Kitty Harvey. I've just completed a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies at King's College London. This is just a question about Mike Pompeo. He certainly seems to be one of the driving force in pursuing a very hawkish policy towards Iran, and he certainly has been known as such since joining the Trump administration. I'm just curious about the roots of his thinking on Iran. Does his kind of hawkishness on Iran have deep roots, extend back a number of years, or is he a relatively recent convert to this sort of thinking on Iran? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more in the back.
Hi, Ken Myrecord, retiree. Baghdad is about a 2-hour drive from the Iranian border. If we continue to stonewall the Iraqis concerning withdrawing our troops, they get nowheres. Through peaceable means, might the Iranians stage a massive invasion and be within the green zone within a couple of hours and be greeted by the Iraqis with those flowers that they didn't bestow on us?
Let me take one more here, actually.
I'm wondering why we...
Can you introduce
Hello,
yourself?
Will Gentinen. I'm just wondering if we really do need to go to war because America has so long relied upon the surgical strike. For example, Osama bin Laden, and now the general. So if we've proven that we can take out the knight, someone has to be thinking, well, they can take out the bishop and the king too. So why bother go to war?
Okay, I have 5 questions. I want to pose it to individual speakers. That way we gain some time and maybe we collect even more questions. Trita, can you answer the sanction question? Are they actually working?
Sanctions are having a devastating effect on the Iranian economy. But there's a significant distinction to be made between the effectiveness of sanctions and the successfulness of sanctions. Effectiveness is if they can inflict pain. There is no doubt that the sanctions have inflicted massive pain on the Iranians, particularly the civilian population. But translating that pain into a desired change in policy is what determines whether the sanctions have been successful. The desired change in policy is that the Iranians would be doing nothing of the things that the Trump administration is saying they're doing more of. So in that sense, the sanctions have not only been unsuccessful, they've been counterproductive. Instead of leading to some form of a capitulation by the Iranians in which they're coming to the table, begging for mercy because the pain is so immense, instead, we are seeing the Iranians counter-escalating America's economic warfare. Now, your questions alludes to the point that there is some sort of an inflection point coming at some point down the road in which they're so running out of money that it would be too difficult for them to continue. I think we may have seen some inflection points earlier this summer, last summer, in which precisely because it was getting too dangerous, they started lashing out, meaning not capitulating, but escalating even further. So we've seen no signs yet, and I doubt that we will, that an Iran that is even more under pressure, has its back even more against the wall, will be more inclined to appease Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, particularly hearing from Trump saying to someone else, you should be normal. That's quite a statement coming out of Trump and Pompeo. So I fear that, on the contrary, this is part of the reason why we're in this situation we're in today. There was a massive escalation by walking out of the JCPOA, engaging in economic warfare. We are seeing the effects of it now, and we may see even more escalation down the road, rather than seeing the type of success that I think you're wishing to see.
Thank you, Truth. Mark, can you take this? Did you
Can I
have
add
something to? Yes.
I think one of the problems is, I think sanction shouldn't be a policy. Sanction is an instrument. There should be a policy, and sanction should be the instrument. So there should be a clear objective about, and that objective should be more than a better JCPOA. And as we see, because of that, there was so many concern about when President Obama focused on too much on JCPOA and ignore other things. I think if there will be a policy, an Iranian policy, it should be more than JCPOA. And sanctions should be an instrument, but there should be a clear objectives which you can rally the allies as well, which should be a consistent throughout the administrations, which shouldn't create a situation that within the same administration, either in Bush time or Obama time, you will have a totally different and contradictory Iranian policies.
Thank you. Mark, can you take this question on what might war look like? I want to ask the Pompeo question this time to Luke, so leave that to Luke.
There have been 3 war games that I am familiar with that the Pentagon has carried out in scenarios against Iran. Only one of those proposed a ground invasion, and in the ground invasion scenario, our troops were stopped halfway to Tehran from the coast. They ran out of fuel. It was too costly. The casualties were too high. It's just not in the cards. Any kind of escalation militarily on the part of the United States would be an air escalation. It would be surgical to begin with. It wouldn't be a full-on onslaught. I think that despite the rhetoric about regime change that you hear from some people here in Washington, that's too difficult. Our attacks would be military-based against their military. They'd probably be very effective. Would they deter Iran? Probably not. But we're in talking about a war with Iran. We're not talking about anything that is, full-on onslaught, 24 hours a day. I think it's quite different, quite costly, and one of the first things that the international community would do in case of such a confrontation would be to call for a ceasefire.
Thank you, Mark. Luke, much has been made about Pompeo's Iran hawkishness, and where is that coming from? Do you know?
Well, it comes from his boss. President Trump and Ted Cruz on the campaign trail held a joint rally together against the JCPOA back in the day when there was 17 other Republican candidates. Trump, for better, for worse, for whatever reason, campaigned from the very beginning of leaving JCPOA, thinking he could probably get a better deal. And this turned into the maximum pressure campaign, and Secretary of State Pompeo has been established and is well known, very close to President Trump. So he's unlikely to go against what the president is thinking on this, and he also probably agrees with most of the president. So I don't think there's any deep-rooted sense of anti-Iranian sentiment that dates back from his time as a congressman or anything like that. So I think it's probably just as simple as that.
Now, you did earlier mention a long-running war, basically, and the military would have those kind of anti-Iran sentiment as well, right?
Yeah, certainly the military would. But are you saying because Pompeo was in the military?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to see if
I mean, he
there are-
was. I think
So it's
he
purely
spent a few
politics then for him.
Yeah, he was in the military in the late '80s, and I think it just stayed in for like the 4 years for his West Point. Yeah, so I don't think that really
Okay.
shaped his
All right.
view. But I want to just quick
Sure.
on this Pompeo point.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you or Mark. Again, I don't know anything about this, but there's been some articles talking about his evangelical background and that is a factor. Is that the case? What is your assessment?
Well, I think that probably drives more on the Israeli policy side of things. I don't think that really plays into the Iran bit, unless I'm missing something.
No, I don't think you're wrong. He's an evangelical Christian. He's talked about the rapture. But I think that it probably has more to do with his support for Israel than, you know. I mean,
That's
They
why
don't necessarily contradict, obviously. Like,
on the
but-
just if I can
yeah,
make
go
a
ahead.
quick observation on the sanctions question. Iran's very resilient, so
They were running out of money a long time ago, right? We keep
yeah,
saying.
I remember
we
when
keep-
Assad only has 6 months left. So they're very resilient. But let's not pretend that Iran was this like benign actor in the Middle East right after JCPOA was agreed to. Even before the sanctions came back, they were causing a lot of problems. And then the point about these war games, my experience with war games is you can kind of get the outcome that you want depending on how it's all framed up. And God forbid we do a ground invasion of Iran. I seriously doubt the president wants to. Certainly the American people don't want it. I don't think anyone wants it. But in 2003, Iraq had the 7th largest military in the world, and in 20 days, the U.S. was in Baghdad. So this idea, if we wanted to get to Tehran, I don't think we're getting stopped halfway because we're running out of fuel. But that's not the hard part. As we've seen in
we're not going to
Iraq,
do it. We're just not going to do it.
Yeah, of course we're not. But this idea that they're going to stop us dead cold halfway because we're running out of fuel, I don't.
Let me throw out a thought there, though, because what Mark is saying is very much based on logic, and we tend to agree. It doesn't make sense. It would be too costly, all of these different things. But one of the first things that happen once war starts is that calculations change. The Israelis thought that they're going to take out Hezbollah with just air power in 2006. They explicitly said there's not going to be any ground troops. 17 days later, they had 30,000 troops going into Lebanon. 17 days after that, they all came back. They achieved none of their objectives, and it was de facto a defeat. So my argument is not that you're wrong. My argument is that once a war starts, a lot of these calculations will change. And that's part of the reason why it's very good not starting wars.
But
Sarita,
these small deployments to the Middle East, no one should misconstrue these as like prep for an invasion of Iran. We had almost 500,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in the Gulf when we invaded Iraq in 2003. So there's no indication whatsoever that this administration is preparing for a ground war with Iran. And the military, what the war will look like will determine how Iran responds to Qassem Soleimani's death. That's what's going to determine what sort of war we're headed to, as the title says.
This is actually a very great discussion, Kılıç. I want to turn to you about that. The audience mentioned surgical versus, full-on war. And it reminded me of how in Syria, Obama administration said, okay, we're going to help the YPG against ISIS. It's tactical and temporary. And it turned into a sort of commitment to Syria 5 years now, right? So if we moving from, like Tarita said, from, tactical to strategic without necessarily planning for it, or things change. Could that also happen in this case, maybe, in terms of answering
I
that
think
question?
this is not the first time that people are talking about war games. During the Obama administration, we had those debates as well, whether United States should launch a missile, at least some strikes to the nuclear facilities. Even in the Bush administration, we had those debates about, until the Natanz and Qum nuclear facilities came out and they figured out that it may be really hard to basically eradicate all of the nuclear facilities. So those debates took place in each and every administration, and it became a traditional thing in American foreign policy that within an administration, you definitely have a plan to how to deal with Iran. You bring up all of the options. You basically say that all options are on the table, and sometimes the administration leak this to press to avoid a confrontation and stop the more hawkish people in Washington, D.C. Sometimes they consider it as a potential deterrent force. But my concern is the killing of Soleimani may actually eradicate that deterrence. That would be a calculation that we will see in the retaliation of, if there will be a retaliation from Iran, that whether the deterrence ended here or not. And whether what would be in terms of military confrontation, what would be the consequences of this attack to that deterrence strategy in the Middle East.
If there are more questions, I want to collect them, but I'm not promising they'll be answered. I just want to give one last word to the panel. Before that, if there are questions, please raise your hand. Yes, Alan.
There we go.
Alan Makovsky Center for American Progress, excuse me. Mark, I wanted to ask you to clarify what you meant about Pompeo getting involved in the chain of command, because at least the way I heard what you said, it was a policy recommendation that he was making. Obviously, the military salutes when the president, when the civilians
It's a good question.
decide.
Thank you.
So I just wasn't clear what you meant by that. And, excuse me, Klitsch, look, it took Turkey, the foreign ministry, 10 hours to issue a statement on this. When they finally did, there was sort of a buried sentence that we don't like, external interventions in the region or assassinations. I mean, it was very low key. Ibrahim Karagül, who's often the alter ego of President Erdogan, was clearly dancing on the grave of Soleimani. I mean, I think I have to conclude.
You mean Ibrahim Karagül is the alter ego?
Yeah, you don't think he is?
I don't know. I never heard about this. This is the first time I'm hearing this.
Well, I think he is. I mean, I don't know. I try to follow him.
Our next panel discussion.
So I don't know. We can disagree, but forget Ibrahim Karagül. Soleimani was an enemy of Turkey. He helped implement a very effective policy in Syria that basically saved the Assad regime. I believe from what I've read that Iran's off and on support of the PKK was at least in part orchestrated by Soleimani. I have to believe that, Ankara was quietly dancing a jig on this. They obviously didn't have responsibility for it, but, they could not have been too saddened to see him go. I just wondered if you could react to that, please.
Any others? Okay, so we'll maybe start with Kulich and then come this way, and we'll end with Luke.
Alan's question was really long, and there were multiple questions in it. So just, I think there is this concern about further destabilization in the region. What you said was correct. There are a lot of reports about him, and there are 4 million Syrians in Turkey. So their feelings are 4 million Syrians in Turkey right now. So their feelings towards him is totally different, right? So they know what Iranian proxies did in the region. But the further destabilization in the region creates major risk. And it's not only for Turkey, it is most of the countries in the region. And considering the crisis in Libya, crisis in Syria, crisis in Iraq, look at Turkey and Iran, and these are all neighbors from sea or from land, right? continuing crisis in Ukraine and crisis in Eastern Mediterranean. So when you see this, there is no place for another destabilization or another crisis in the place for Turkey or any other country in the region. So the main concern, when you look at the statement of the foreign ministry, there's 5 times the word stability used, right?
Why do you think it took so long?
Well, I don't know I wasn't in Ankara, or I didn't check, like the sources, anything about that. But there is this concern about stability, I think, probably is more important than anything else right now for Turkey.
Mark.
Let me try to shed some light on the chain of command comment that I made about Pompeo inserting himself into the chain of command. Between the administration of Mr. Mattis and Secretary Esper, the Secretary of State traveled to U.S. Central Command for briefings and to check with the commander of the U.S. Central Command, which is in Tampa. Now, for those of you who don't, study the military, I've spent 40 years studying it, so that might seem kind of like a footnote and unimportant. But it was stunning that he did it. And the military was surprised, and there were people at the U.S. Central Command, very high-ranking senior people in uniform, and kind of turned to each other and said, what is the Secretary of State doing here? Shouldn't he be... I don't know that, but I've not heard that in my life. George Shultz didn't, supersede Mr. Weinberger by going visiting military installations. He was very sensitive to who controlled what. And the tradition in our country is that the Pentagon and the State Department sometimes, not to our benefit, have been very competitive. That is no longer true. There are not contending forces or turf wars going on in this administration between the Pentagon and the State Department. Mr. Pompeo is, as I said in my talk, without peer, and that causes some discomfort on the part of the military, who would like to have a stronger Secretary of State to stand up and represent military equities in these debates. Secretary of Defense Esper needs to stand up and provide, a defense of military views and present their views very clearly. And it's not clear to senior officers that is happening to the extent that they wish, which is behind my comment that Mr. Pompeo is seen as inserting himself into the chain of command, which goes from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders, the geographic combatant commanders, bypassing the JCS and certainly not including the Secretary of State. That's my explanation.
And you don't have any other concluding comments?
No, I'm very pleased that our president is stopping the malign influence and the tentacles of Iran in behalf of our benign and altruistic foreign policy.
Thank you for the sarcasm, Mark. Tarita?
Just some concluding remarks. Part of the reason I find this to be problematic is because leaving the region militarily and seizing the belief that we have to dominate it militarily does lie in U.S. national interest. This has not made us more safe in the last 20, 25 years. It has not brought stability to the Middle East. And for the U.S.'s global interests, there are far more strategically important regions than this. Yet, despite all of his promises of leaving, he is doing things that are getting the United States more and more stuck into the region, potentially a war, whether it's a land war or not. And ultimately, that does not serve U.S. national interest.
Thank you. Luke, last word.
Yeah, well, I think everyone has heard enough from me about this, but I'll say this. If you play with fire, you're going to get burnt. And that's what happened. If you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. And we're going to have great debates about America's role in the Middle East, America's role in the world. Should we engage more? Should we withdraw? But when it comes to the question of, in the long term, will Qassem Soleimani's demise be better for the region? The answer, in my opinion, is yes, it will be better for the region.
Thank you. This has been a very lively discussion, and I'm really pleased about that. I hope you have gained some insights from this discussion. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
It was fun.
Appreciate it.